I am vengeance. I am the night. I am. What should have been a better animated series figure? Hey everyone, Dark Spider Davey here, bringing you guys another McFarlane toy review. It's one that I've been anticipating for quite some time, up until I opened him up, and now I'm actually a little nervous to do this review because it is for the McFarlane Toys interpretation of the animated series Batman. So, as you can see, this is inspired by one of the seminal cartoons of the 90s, because we all know by now that Batman the Animated Series is just immaculate as far as writing is concerned. It's great not just for a Batman show or an animated show, it's just as a show in general, it's great. And that incarnation of Batman, voiced by the legendary Kevin Conroy, is one of the best versions of Batman that we've ever seen. Even if he's just in animated form, he transcends that medium, and he's just right up there on a pedestal along with Michael Keaton and even Christian Bale. And of course, the rest could be kind of debated as far as what kind of version of Batman you prefer, but Kevin Conroy has earned his keep long ago. And here, McFarlane Toys brought us their version of that character. And after toying around with him for a little bit, I would say that this guy is quite damn close to being a great animated series Batman figure, but it kind of misses the mark just ever so slightly. Let's get one thing out of the way. As far as detailing and textures and all that, he's gonna be completely matte from top to bottom without any real detail. But that's expected because this is supposed to be inspired by the Bruce Timm animation of that animated series kind of style. And because of that, everything's just going to be very plain and just straightforward as far as textures and details are concerned. And I wouldn't really want it any other way. You got the utility belt, my crotch shot as I always like to cut to, but of course it's going to be in that animated series style where it's literally just a square for a buckle and the pouches on its side. And then going along the costume, you got the color schemes that you're usually accustomed to when it comes to an animated series figure, where you got the gray on the yellow and the black. And everything else just pans out the way that you expected. Even the boots and the gauntlets are pretty simple and straightforward, but they still have that curvature that you would expect out of a Bruce Timm animation, specifically on the bat symbol. Now, I don't know what it is. I really dig the sculpting of the chest piece right there. Again, very reminiscent of that Bruce Timm animation, but the chest symbol, for some reason, it's its own piece, kind of etched into the actual plastic of the figure. I don't know why it couldn't just be a paint job on top of it to kind of give it a broader sense of smoothness, but it's actually a whole entire separate piece, actually encrusted inside of the chest area. So from a physical standpoint, it feels pretty good to kind of feel and have it be contextualized in there, but in terms of aesthetics, I would have preferred an actual paint, not a sticker, but an actual paint etching or a paint job for the bat symbol to just kind of mimic more so of that animated look. Then we go on to the cape and cowl, and though the cowl, I like that it's still very much the animated series Batman with the very broad jaw line as well as the grimace on his face. And then we also again got the cowl where you have the ears pointed towards the back as opposed to the front, and then the white eyes. Only that in figure form you can plainly see that the eyes are kind of deepened in, but it actually looks kind of cool. It actually works for the figure, and I appreciate it. What I appreciate even more, though, is the cape. Even though it's, again, very straightforward, just kind of drapes down, and you have the little cutouts and the little wing parts here at the bottom. The little subtle detail that is, a very minor thing, but it still very much pays respects to the animated source material, is that it's black on the exterior, but when you look at it in the interior, you can clearly see that it's like a, kind of like a royal blue. And that's very reminiscent of the animated series as a whole. So I thought that that was a really nice touch. And then we get to the actual posture or the design of the figure. Again, hearkening to Bruce Timm's animation. He's got the broad shoulders, but with the really narrow legs. So huge respect and points towards them being faithful to the source material as far as sculpting is concerned, with the shoulders being broader than your average human person's. It's very stylized and it's very reminiscent of that version. But unfortunately, this is where my biggest crux with the figure comes into play, and that is that though it's meant to be very faithful to that source material of what you saw on Saturday mornings through that animated series, it doesn't necessarily translate that greatly into action figure form. For one, it's actually doing a miraculous job of standing on its own right now, because this guy's a bit of a biatch to get to stand properly. If you get these legs fixated as they are before you, he'll stand just fine, especially in this very justified sort of position that he always finds himself in the series. But if you were to go ahead and start posing him or maneuvering him in any way, he is just so top heavy because of this design that any other pose besides this one is going to be a chore to do. And the posability in and of itself is also a little stifled, even more so than your average McFarlane figure. Sure, they still have the 22 points of articulation, but there's so much that's actually constricted and limited that it almost makes me wonder that they could have maybe just kind of cut out the middleman and not have to deal with all those points entirely. For one, you still got the head joint that rotates, I want to say 360 degrees, but mine came so stiff that he can kind of move that far back, and I could press it a little bit more, but I start to get a little bit of resistance, and I just don't want to press my luck. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it alone, but I'm going to safely assume that it could rotate 360 degrees. Then we get to the shoulders, which is my biggest disappointment, because again, they're meant to be very broad, and then this cape is supposed to be encroached all over the shoulder area, reminiscent of that animated figure version, that the shoulders are pretty much static. I mean, yes, you have the two joints going on right here, very a la McFarlane, where you have one piece that's meant to be a form of being able to kind of shrug in and shrug out the shoulders, as well as the ball joint here that allows the general possibility of being able to rotate the arms, what you would expect to be 360 degrees vertically and then inwards and outwards, but moving them is, to me, quite ineffective. As you can see, I'm getting a lot of resistance, and it's not just because of the ratcheted joints, but rather just the plastic just kind of pressing down on them and causing a severe lack of mobility. So you can kind of go about that far outwards and forwards, but when moving up, that's really about it, really. And then kind of extending them, yes, you can go up until that point. Rotating in place, you could do what would virtually be 360 degrees, as you can see before you there, but it starts to loosen. And yeah, you do also have a bicep swivel that helps out in that mobility ever so slightly, but there's an awful lot of resistance. And again, I don't know what time will do to this figure, but as of right now, it's not necessarily all that friendly as far as the shoulders are concerned. And then moving to the elbows, two things. One, we only get one joint as opposed to the two that I've seen in other figures, so especially from the McFarlane line, so that was a little bit of a bummer. It was even a further bummer to then realize that the actual cut that they molded for the elbows are actually at a little bit of a slant, so when you bend it at the elbow, it bends in a very specific way. And sure, you're able to kind of interpret it in a different styling thanks to that bicep swivel here, but anything else, you're just gonna have to, toy around and get used to it, especially if you want the parts of the gauntlet right here, the little hooks, to extend in a different position. You're gonna have to rely on the bicep swivel as opposed to the elbow one. And then of course we come to the coveted wrist joint, the ball wrist joint that allows 360 degree movement for the wrist right about there, as well as a slight incline inwards and outwards about that far in, and then about that far out, as you see before you right there. And then moving on to the torso, this is where it gets a little bit more generous. You got a divide right here in the middle of the abdomen that allows quite a bit of mobility, as you can see right there. But of course, the molding and the sculpting of the figure starts to show a little bit there that it starts to look just a little awkward. And then moving down to the waist, you do have a slight movement going on, but it's very, very stilted that it begs to question whether or not there's an actual piece in there, or it's simply just the utility belt molded plastic that's actually freely moving about to kind of cause that illusion. So up to your interpretation there, but from what I gather, it could be one of the two. I'm just not going to move the piece too much. Actually, no, I can kind of see it from here. Now that I look at it, there does seem to be a cutout there, but I don't see the wrist giving any kind of way, so I'm not going to force it. And then we get to the legs. This might be an isolated incident, but if you guys do share a similar experience, please let it be known in the comment section. These legs are actually rather loose. I know, again, they're meant to invoke the look of the animated series Batman, but not only is he evidently going to end up being top heavy because of that, but these leg joints ended up being a lot looser than I would have wanted them to, especially here at the top ball joint that allows movement about that far forward, that far back, and then there's a slight way, like a slightly slanted way that they were molded here at the top, that upon my first playthrough of the figure, when I took him out of the box, this leg actually came off, and my heart and stomach just sank because I was under the impression that I broke it. Thankfully, it was just a ball joint, just had to pop it back in, and everything was hunky-dory from that point forward. But other than that, I was actually pretty flabbergasted by the fact that this was the first figure where a full-blown limb just popped off, especially coming from McFarlane. So that was a slight red flag in my vocation. But you are able to then extend the legs about that far outwards. You do have 2 joints at the knee as opposed to the elbow. You actually got 2 of them going on right here that allow full bendability about that far back. Just gonna give it a little bit of a press because it is ratcheted. And then moving down to the bottom of the legs, no shin swivels or bends of any kind, but of course you do have the ball joint at the ankle that allows movement that far back as well as that much forward. Now, in terms of pivoting, there is some slight pivot, but what's becoming a little bit of a trend with this figure, there's also a slant molding going on in that ankle joint that allows pivoting, but only at an angle. I never seem to be able to directly pivot left and right. It always pivots just off to a side. And this is my first time that I noticed this with one of the McFarlanes that I've covered. The other McFarlanes, they would pivot left and right clearly and direct in a much more directed fashion. Here, it's more like at a slant, and I don't know if that was intentional or again if that was isolated. But you can rotate the ankles 360 degrees. It's just again at a bit of an angle. I'm not able to do it completely horizontally, and when bending it forward, like I said, it just feels like something is kind of off unless you kind of gestate a little bit more and move the ankle ball joint along with the foot piece instead of as separate pieces. So you kind of have to toy around with it a little bit more than you would expect. And then of course you do have slightly more pointed toesies. So you kind of saw me struggling a little bit with the articulation there, and that combined with his top heaviness, posability with this guy is actually quite extraneous. That getting poses to shoot for this B-roll that you might be seeing before you was a little bit of a chore and hassle, and that was just not something that I was getting used to doing for an animated series Batman. And so I had to resort to most of those default poses that you would find him in the animated series. I don't know if that was meant to be intentional, but that casual, looking up in the sky look that he's got going on in the title sequence, or the general neutral stance that he is when Commissioner Gordon is debriefing him on what he has to do next, that's pretty much what you really have to resort to with Batman here in McFarlane format. Now, as far as accessories, he comes with the basics, except I think this time they did something a slightly bit unique from the other McFarlanes that I've covered thus far. You of course got the Batarang, which this time comes in that animated series styling where one side is completely curved off with no etchings of any kind, but then you also have the wings cut out at the bottom. This particular Batarang actually comes bent, but on purpose. That was not an accident. That wasn't like damaged or anything in the packaging. It's meant to give it that much more stylized look from the animated series, as if it's being thrown and swung and kind of curving in its animation arc as it's moving about in the screen. You know how sometimes when things get animated in cartoon format and 2D format, animators actually need to take liberties with the morphing and the bending of certain shapes to give it that life, give it that motion. And that's kind of what they're going for as far as the stylized look of this particular Batarang here, and I respect it. I dig it a lot. And then we have his grapple gun, which overall, I'm really satisfied with. It still harkens back to the look that it has in the animated series. This time, it doesn't necessarily look silver, but it looks black with the red buttons on the side. I like the detail and call to the buttons on the side that he presses. The grapple hook itself, however, is a little different. I don't mind it. I'm actually more indifferent than anything else, but I would have rather preferred the more accurate grapple that he's got going on in the comics that looks like an actual claw, as opposed to the more arrow-like structure that we got going on right here. And then we get to what I personally think is the most unique thing to come out of the McFarlanes that I've covered, and that is an extra hand accessory. but not just for one hand, but for both hands. And those hands are molded to then hold the accessories in place. Whether you choose them to be the grapple gun or the batarang, you actually have holding hands for both hands respectively. And popping them in and out is actually quite easy. I'm actually surprised by how well structured the joints are inside here to pop the hands in and out. At first I thought I had broken them because the actual pegs here at the end are flattened, but with a slight little like break off point from the plastic that it legitimately looks like I broke the figure. So if you guys have this figure and you're thinking about getting it, and when you pop out the hands and you look at this piece and you think to yourself, oh, I might have broken the joint, don't fret. That's literally how it looks like. It's meant to have a slight increase in size here at the very far end of the peg to then cause that little pop that you feel when you pop one of the hands in. So don't fret, that's natural. I don't know why they molded it like that, but it's completely normal. So you just take one hand, pop it off, and then you take the other one, give it a slight push, you feel the pop. You don't really necessarily hear it, but you do feel it. And there you have the other much more relaxed hand to then hold one of the accessories should you choose. Just a heads up, however, that the accessories, whether it be the batarang or the grapple hook, don't necessarily fit all that well into his hands. Regardless of how they molded them to look like they could hold them, it's gonna take some finessing. So I thought that was kind of neat that they do throw that in, and this is my first McFarlane. There might be others that do come with more hands and more legs and body parts to kind of inner swap and give it a much more customized look, but this is personally my first figure that comes with this extent of accessories that I've covered thus far. And you know, this might change in the future, but for now, this is the animated series Batman. And if you couldn't already tell from my impressions, I'm actually a little bummed out. It's not necessarily a bad figure. It still has some really good quality of life things that McFarlane likes to do as far as the actual molding of the plastic, the 22 points or, you know, mostly 22 points of articulation. But there were a couple of mishaps that I feel were a little too McFarlane-y, if that were to make any sense. Like, McFarlane was too busy trying to give it its stylized look and be a little too faithful to the Bruce Timm material that I think it didn't translate 100% in figure form. That it almost makes me regret not getting that DC Direct, because my apprehensions of that original DC Direct figure was that his shoulders were a little too narrow, he was a little too stilted, I didn't really see too much articulation in the images that I saw. But it technically probably would have been a much more robust figure to pose and to play around with, as opposed to this one, who looks great on the mantelpiece, but as far as customizability and posability, he might come just a little bit short. So being that right now you don't really have that much of a choice, because the primary way to get, as far as I can tell, the primary way to get the DC Direct Batman Animated Series figure is to get it through scalpers and through eBay and those other means. And right now the McFarlane figure is the only one to really get at market price. So this is ultimately your best bet if you're looking for an animated series figure, or simply just wait until another manufacturer takes up the mantle, whether it be through a 1/6 scale Hot Toys figure or something from Figma or Mafex, whichever one you so choose, and see what happens there. But for now, I would say I am at least glad that I own some kind of animated series Batman figure. I just wish it could have been personally a little bit better. Don't kill me. Anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let me know your guys' 2 cents in the comment section below. Make sure to hit the thumbs up video if you liked it, or if you didn't, hit the thumbs down. Make sure to check out this other video showing up on screen that's also related to something else Batman, as well as also check out the rest of the channel for other Spider-Man and Batman videos. And as always, stay humble. I'll see you guys on the next one.